This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. The West is getting nervous again over China's diplomacy in the Pacific. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting 8 Pacific Island nations in 10 days, which has been described by Western commentators as a threat to regional peace. Now, China says its partnership with the Pacific Island states are not exclusive, and Australia, New Zealand, and others are more than welcome to be part of it. Now, for more on China's engagement with Pacific Island states, we're joined at this moment from Shanghai by Li Yanliang. He's an assistant research fellow of the Institute for Foreign Policy Studies at Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, and also from Darwin, Australia, by Daryl Guppy. He's an independent economic and political analyst. Welcome, gentlemen. Daryl, let me go to you first. How would you compare Joe Biden's vision of engagement with the Asia-Pacific allies and partners with his recently signed signature project called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? If you compare that versus China's diplomatic engagement with the Pacific Island countries, with Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, visiting 8 countries in 10 days.
Biden's proposal is take it or leave it. It's not developed with consultation with the countries involved. It's presented as a final document, whereas Wang Yi's presentation is a proposal that's been discussed amongst equals amongst the Pacific Island countries. So there is room for modification, there is room for change. And in fact, Wang Yi has come back and said, let's talk further about this. Let's take into account what's been said. Let's bring in Australia and New Zealand. Very different from the American approach.
Dr. Li, how would you characterize China's diplomatic engagement with the South Pacific countries? What are China's geopolitical calculations? I suppose there are trade and investment calculations as well.
I don't really think that geopolitical thing is the major focus here. I think China and the Pacific Island nations are having a prolonged economic and social ties, and also China, as a developing country, has always committed to development of South-South cooperation and help other developing countries' economic growth and poverty lift. So I think for Wang Yi's visit to Pacific Islands, first we can see, I agree with Mr. Guppy, that China is giving out proposals, and we are proposing corporations that we think are really helpful to our friends in Pacific nations. And also the proposal is based on we respect the sovereignty and of the Pacific nations, and if the Pacific nations have doubts, we can see, okay, we can discuss this later. And also I think very important aspect of Wang's proposal and Wang's visit in the Pacific Islands that China is taking an inclusive approach to the region. China claimed that we will respect Pacific nations' ties with other countries, and also China is open to the tripartite cooperation in the region. So I think the message is very clear. China is here to cooperate, not to compete.
Daryl, let me turn to you. China's engagement with the South Pacific Island countries is more closely watched by the Western commentators and strategists, arguably, than many inside China itself, I would say. How would you compare the Western approach towards the Pacific Island countries? Because recently you wrote, and I quote, "The Western approach to the needs of the Pacific carries a large historical trust deficit." Can you elaborate? What is this trust deficit?
The trust deficit comes from promises that Western countries have made, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, that have not been delivered or have been delivered in much less than was originally promised. So there is a trust deficit there. And certainly Australia, who has ignored the Pacific Islands to a great extent over the last decade, has this lack of engagement that it has to recover. And the new Australian government, with Foreign Minister Penny Wong, is committed to engaging more within the Asia-Pacific and particularly the Pacific Islands region. So it becomes a matter of what do you deliver? Do you deliver things that benefit the delivering country, in this case Australia or the United States, or are you genuinely concerned with developing economic stability and growth and progress within the region, which in itself builds security within the region? They're the key questions. So the trust deficit is the ability to deliver on the promises that have been made. And the West has failed very much in that in quite a number of occasions. Certainly, short-term assistance with disaster relief and so on, that's delivered.
As I assume many of our audience in the West are not necessarily familiar with those historical episodes, right? When you think about the nuclear tests carried out by the Americans in their affiliated or loosely affiliated Pacific Island countries. Those nuclear tests did great harm to locals physically and in terms of public health, but those were pretty much disregarded or dismissed by American military officials.
It's not just the Americans that are a case there. You need to remember that the French conducted a wide range of nuclear testing in the Pacific in the 1970s. Again, you have displaced populations that have little or no compensation that's taken place. So the history of engagement of these colonial powers, because that's what they are and what they were, isn't something that generally takes into account the interests of Pacific Island countries. This is where China has an advantage, because China has not been involved in this sort of delivery historically.
Yeah, Dr. Li, why is the West so concerned, so worried, or, to put it bluntly, so jealous with China's engagement with the South Pacific Island countries?
The major issue here is that the U.S. and its allies are seeing things through a narrative of Cold War style that is based on geopolitics, based on the spheres of influence. And it is because of the United States and Australia's Cold War logic that the Pacific nations' needs to lift the poverty and to achieve sustainable development goals has long been ignored. And I think that is why China is having more influence now in the Pacific Island countries.
Daryl, what do you think?
I certainly agree that there's a geopolitical aspect to it. There's no question about it. However, we need to remember that China has usually achieved its geopolitical aspirations through trade rather than through military action, whereas the West has been the reverse. It tends to be military action rather than trade. So the West looks at the way that China is becoming involved in the Pacific Islands and says, if we were doing this, this is what we would do, and therefore it's a security risk. So it's a difference of perception and a lack of understanding at the way that China has engaged traditionally and historically with countries outside of its borders.
Take China-Solomon's cooperation, for example, right? I mean, many people don't understand why can Beijing help the Solomon Islands with, number one, disaster relief, because after all, this is an island nation susceptible to climate change, and number two, disaster relief when you talk about cyclones, tsunamis, and number three, local securities. We've seen the fact that situations could get a lot worse when riots took place, and China's security forces pledged to help with that. I mean, why couldn't China do that with local officials? Dr. Li.
In previous years, it has been praised also by the Western world that China is taking more responsibilities and making more contributions to global governance, including the disaster relief things. So I think basically, if it's only for the benefits of the Pacific Island nations themselves, definitely China's help should be welcomed. And if you're in the middle of a huge disaster, you definitely want to have all the resources, as many resources as you have, help. And also, we know that in Solomon Island, there are a lot of Chinese people living there, and Chinatown is, in many situations, have been one of the major targets during the domestic riots.
Daryl, what do you think? Why is Canberra so nervous about China's security agreement, among other things, with the Solomon Islands?
This is part of a narrative that particularly applied to the previous government. We're yet to see whether it applies to the new government that's just been elected. So they saw China as a threat across the board, and everything that China did had a security focus. They were very afraid of China in this sense. Not a good approach to take to the second most powerful economy within the world, or the most, depending on how you wish to measure it. So the important thing to remember with Pacific Islands is, as Franco Ariara said, we are friends to all and enemies to none. That's their position. That's Pacific Islands' position. But Australia and America feel you've got to be in one camp or the other. So they are trying to create, to some extent, an extension of the Cold War within the Pacific Island countries. And this is something that the island countries themselves are trying to resist.
I want to ask you about the new Australian government, where they had a new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. He is sending the new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, to Fiji for a multi-day trip. Many would argue that this is a hedge against China as well. How would you envision the new Australian government's approach towards China be different than that of the former Australian government?
What we're looking for is an exercise, a greater emphasis on diplomacy as the first reaction to being able to work with China and work with changing relations within the Pacific Islands, etc. And Penny Wong has certainly shown that this is the step she wants to take. The visit to the Pacific Islands, the Solomons and so on, is the first step in that direction. They're also visiting Indonesia shortly as well. So there's a greater emphasis on engagement within the region. Now, the key factor is to turn that engagement into cooperative engagement in the region. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi has already extended that offer by inviting Australia and New Zealand to be involved in further discussions about the proposals that were presented at Fiji.
I mean, Australia had the tradition of walking in locksteps strategically and militarily with Washington. Even more so during the former Australian cabinet. Do you think this is still the case? The nature of Canberra's close geopolitical ties with Washington will change at all, given that there's new cabinet in Canberra?
We think there will be slow changes that are taking place. Over the last decade of the previous government, you are correct, it was very much in lockstep with the Americans. But governments under Malcolm Fraser, under Whitlam, under Keating, were all looking at an independent foreign policy. So in many cases, they agreed with what the United States was doing, but they also pursued independent agendas. So the establishment of APEC, for instance, was initiated by Australia, much against the wishes of Washington at the time. So we're hoping to see a return to that independent Australian foreign policy where they are not always in lockstep with what is happening in Washington.
All right, Dr. Li, finally, I want to ask you about some specifics. We saw that Wang Yi was co-chairing a meeting with nearly a dozen South Pacific Island nations in the second foreign ministers meetings in the region. What do you think are the concrete deliverables, specifics that came out of this meeting?
Some of the cooperation frameworks have been enhanced, and we have established cooperation on economic dialogue and also on regional dialogue on climate change. And I think definitely those kind of topics that are really related to the real needs of the Pacific Island countries. For example, the Pacific Island countries are facing the most challenges from the impacts of climate change. And I think China has been launching out climate resilience cooperation and dialogue with Pacific nations to help them to be better prepared to the climate impact.
Daryl, what do you think is the major significance of the Chinese foreign minister's visit to the Pacific Island countries?
The major significance is that it shows cooperation within the region and a willingness to engage with all participants, not just the Pacific Island countries, but with Australia and New Zealand and others who have interest. We need to remember that these small countries seek support and funding from multiple sources. They make rational decisions in their search for that developmental funding. China is really good with transport and power. Western donors do social sectors. Private bondholders provide general and short-term budgeting finance. So the PICs, the Pacific Island countries, are looking for cooperation, not exclusion, and not exclusive deals that cut one group out from another.
Alrighty, Daryl Guppy, independent economic and political analyst, Dr. Li Yanliang, assistant research fellow at Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Thank you both so very much.